in Victoria Morgan, 32, a Manhattan lawyer who wins hard cases and goes home to a quiet view over Central Park. None of that prepared me for the way my family can turn love into a debt. At my sister's wedding, my mother took my arm and smiled for the room while she whispered, "Darling, we need a little family chat." We stepped into a corner. My father folded his hands like a judge who had already decided. "You don't need all that space, Victoria. Give your penthouse to your sister." When I said no, my mother's smile didn't blink. Selfish children don't deserve success. The glass in my hand trembled. I laughed once because it hurt, and before I could finish saying, "It's my home," my sister swept in veil and all and said, "We want your penthouse, Vivi." Not a question, a claim. I told her the answer was no. She slapped me. 200 guests went silent. That was the moment everything shattered. But to understand it, you have to step back with me into the beginning of that day. I remember walking through the wide doors of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom and feeling as though I had stepped into a world designed to remind me that I did not belong. The chandeliers above were glowing like captured stars, and every table shimmered with flowers and crystal, all perfectly arranged for the kind of wedding that would be whispered about for years. The whispers had already started. They followed me from the moment I entered the room. 200 guests had gathered in gowns and tuxedos, and while they smiled politely when I passed, I heard the words behind their smiles. She is the older sister, still unmarried. She is the one who spends her life in courtrooms, too busy to build a family. Their words slid through the air like quiet blades, reminding me that no matter what I had achieved here, I was only defined by what I lacked. Across the room, Samantha, my younger sister, glided like a queen in her custom Vera Wang gown. The fabric trailed behind her in perfect folds, her smile wide as she accepted every compliment, as though she had been preparing for this moment since birth. The guests surrounded her in a circle of admiration, her husband to be at her side, her auburn hair gleaming in the light. She had always been the golden child, and today that glow was blinding. I paused, taking in the grandeur, and caught the sound of another whisper near me. Someone remarked in awe that the wedding had cost nearly $300,000, as if that number was a badge of honor, and then another voice followed with a hushed tone saying, "And her sister owns that Central Park penthouse worth millions." The words were not spoken with respect, but with a kind of resentment, as though my success was an inconvenience, something that needed to be explained away. My stomach tightened, and I felt that familiar weight press down on me. I was proud of what I had built for myself, but in this room, surrounded by people who adored my sister, it only made me stand out more, and not in a way that felt safe. Elaine, my mother, appeared beside me then, her perfume heavy and her smile rehearsed. "Darling, you look radiant," she said, kissing me on the cheek. Her words might have sounded warm to anyone listening, but I knew that tone. It was the same tone she used whenever she wanted something. I thanked her, my voice, even though inside, I felt the old ache of never being enough in her eyes. She was already scanning the room, her attention flickering to someone more important, leaving me standing in the glow of her practiced charm. My father, Richard, was across the room speaking with Samantha and her groom. He looked toward me, once his eyes sharp and measuring, then leaned back into the conversation with a nod I could not hear. It was a look I had seen before, the kind that meant something was being planned. A shiver ran through me, but I forced it away. Not tonight, I told myself. Tonight, I would keep the peace. Yet even as I tried to settle into the background, I felt the air around me tighten. Everywhere I turned, Sam's name was being spoken. Her dress admired, her future praised. People congratulated my parents on raising such a beautiful daughter, and I stood nearby, invisible, though the whispers about me never stopped. They spoke of how unusual it was that I had never married, how strange that I lived alone in such a large home, as though my independence was a puzzle that needed solving. I lifted a glass of champagne and let it tremble in my hand, watching Sam at the centre of her stage. She laughed easily, tossed her hair, touched her husband's arm, with a kind of calculated grace that drew even more eyes to her. She had the admiration she always craved, and my parents basked in it as though it were their own. I tried to remind myself of what I had accomplished, the cases I had won, the nights I had worked until dawn, the life I had built with no one to lean on but myself. But in this ballroom, none of that mattered. Here I was, the unmarried sister, the one with too much space and not enough love, the one who would never fit into the picture my family wanted to show the world. I smiled when people looked at me, but inside I was shrinking, folding myself smaller so their stares would hurt less. Still beneath all the sparkle and music, a truth pressed against my chest. The smiles around me were not meant for me. They never had been. And as I stood in that room, I began to sense that the night was not only about celebrating Sam's new life, it was also about something else, something aimed at me. I did not know yet what shape it would take, but I knew I had walked into a trap that had been waiting all along. I did not have to wait long to see it spring shut. My mother drifted toward me with that look I knew too well, the one she wore when she wanted something but wanted to pretend she was being gracious. She slipped her arm through mine and whispered, "Darling, we need a little family chat." My stomach sank. Family chats never ended well. My father joined us tall in his tuxedo eyes, sharp, and between the two of them, I felt myself being herded across the ballroom. They led me to a quieter corner, though not so private that people could not glance our way. The quartet played on, but in that corner it was as if the music faded, replaced by the beat of my pulse. Richard looked at me as though weighing his words. "We have been thinking about your living situation," he said. I forced a smile and asked, "What about it?" Elaine touched my hand with hers, cold and deliberate. "Sam and Daniel need more space," she said softly. "And you have such a large apartment, too large for one person." My throat tightened. They were not easing into it, they were striking straight at the heart of what I had worked for. I tried to keep my voice even. "That is my home. I earned it. I paid for it." Richard's voice cut in deeper now. "Family comes first. It always has. It always should." He leaned closer, his tone wrapped in false reason. "You do not need all that space, Victoria. You rattle around in it by yourself while your sister is starting a family." Elaine chimed in quickly as though rehearsed. "Sam might already be pregnant," she said, her eyes bright as if she were sharing wonderful news. The words hit me like a stone. I looked at her and saw not truth, but strategy. It was a lie meant to corner me with guilt. My hands grew cold around the stem of my glass. "You are asking me to give up my home for something that is not even real yet," I said quietly. Richard straightened his jaw set. "This is not asking." His voice implied, "This is telling." And then Sam appeared gliding into our circle with a smile that barely covered the steel beneath it. She slipped her hand through Daniel's arm and said clear enough for me to hear, but low enough to seem casual. "We want your penthouse. Not, we hope not, we wonder, but want, as if it were already hers." The arrogance in her voice made my stomach churn. I stared at her, remembering the nights I had studied until dawn, the years of debt, the endless hours I had worked to climb my way into that home. And here she was swaying in her wedding gown, expecting me to hand it over as though it had been waiting for her all along. I managed to speak through the lump in my throat. "That is not happening. It is mine." Sam's smile widened, cruel in its certainty. "You do not even need 3 bedrooms, she said, her voice laced with mockery. "You do not even have a boyfriend." Her words sliced through me, and my mother did nothing to stop her. Instead, Elaine added, "Darling, think of your sister's future, think of the children. Do you want them to grow up in a cramped rental when you are sitting alone in all that space?" My father nodded, as though the matter was settled. "You will still have a roof over your head. Daniel has a studio. It is perfectly fine for one person." The insult was so heavy I almost laughed. They were asking me to trade the life I had built for a small box I had never chosen. Around us, a few guests glanced over, sensing the rising tension. Their eyes flicked between Sam in her shining gown and me standing rigid in my dress. Sam smirked, enjoying the show. Richard's glare told me that resistance would not be tolerated. Elaine squeezed my arm hard, her nails pressing into my skin, and whispered, Do the right thing, Victoria. This is what family means. My chest burned with anger, but beneath it was something sharper, the sting of betrayal. In that moment, it was clear. They were not protecting me. They were not proud of me. They were using me. And they did not care who saw. I swallowed hard and kept my voice steady, though I wanted to scream. I told them again, "It is my home. I will not give it up." Their faces hardened to Ungan. Their smiles slipped, and in the ballroom full of applause and music and congratulations, I felt the walls close in. They had shown me their hands. This night was never just about a wedding. It was about taking from me what I had built, and they were willing to do it right there under the chandeliers. My thoughts had barely formed when Sam leaned closer, her voice smooth but sharp enough to cut. "You do not even have a boyfriend," she said with a sweet smile that did not reach her eyes. "What do you need 3 bedrooms for?" Her words were loud enough to carry beyond our little circle, and I felt the shift in the air as nearby guests pretended not to listen, while clearly hanging on every word. A couple of them smirked. Others looked down at their glasses, but no one spoke up. Not even my parents. My mother gave a small approving nod as though Sam had voiced what she herself believed. My father stood stiff, his jaw tight, but there was no defense for me in his eyes, only cold agreement. The sting of humiliation burned hot in my chest, but it was not only the words, it was the way they landed with such ease, the way my family allowed them to linger in the air, as though they were truth. And in that moment my mind slipped back uninvited to all the years when I'd already been made to feel smaller beside her. I remembered being 10 years old, sitting at the dinner table with homework spread out in front of me, while Sam pranced through the room, showing off a new doll. My mother had smiled and said, "One day, everything will be yours, Sam." The words had been casual tossed like confetti, but I had felt them sink deep into my chest. I remembered Christmas mornings when Sam's pile of gifts towered high while mine was neat and modest, explained away as fair since I was older and needed less. I remembered school plays where Sam, even with no lines, received roses and applause while I sat with perfect grades that no one cared to mention. I remembered being 17, working part-time jobs to save for college, coming home exhausted, to find my parents clapping for Sam because she had been chosen as prom committee treasurer. She was called charming and bright, while I was told I was too serious, too focused, that I should learn from her. The memories tumbled, one after another, each of them painted with the same message: she was the golden child, the one who mattered, the one who was promised the best. And me, I was expected to step aside, to work harder, to demand nothing. Standing in that ballroom, listening to her mock me in front of strangers, I saw the pattern stretch like a chain from childhood to this very night. My sacrifices had been invisible, my achievements brushed aside, while her every whim was nurtured and excused. Sam tilted her head, watching my silence, as though she had scored another victory. She added softly, almost sweetly, "You have had your time, Vivi. It is my turn now." My mother reached out and placed a hand on my arm. "Stop fighting," she whispered. "This is about family." Family. The word was supposed to mean love, but from her lips it meant obedience. It meant giving up what was mine so that Sam could shine brighter. It meant swallowing the sting of favoritism and pretending it was duty. My throat felt dry, my heart pounding against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. I said nothing more because I knew if I opened my mouth now, it would all pour out in a rush of rage. So I stood still, letting them believe they had cowed me while inside me something shifted. The humiliation pressed down heavy and sharp, but beneath it I felt a different weight rising. A seed of defiance, a refusal that no insult could erase. Around us the guests were whispering, watching some with pity, some with judgment, but none stepping forward. Sam smirked again, turning back toward her husband with the air of someone who had already claimed her prize. I looked at her, and in that look I saw every moment of my life when I had been told, without words, that I did not matter as much as she did. And I knew with a clarity that settled deep inside me this night was not just about an apartment or a wedding. It was about years of being cast in the shadows while she basked in the light. They had always crowned her the golden child, but tonight they expected me to pay the price for it. I pulled away from their little circle and stepped back into the ballroom, forcing myself to breathe, to blend into the glitter of the celebration. Yet everywhere I turned, I felt eyes following me. Conversations hushed when I passed, then picked up again with the faint hum of curiosity. I was not just another guest anymore. I was on display, though I could not yet see the full picture of why. My mother was gliding from table to table, graceful and practiced, her hand brushing the arm of a businessman here, a socialite there, her voice always just loud enough for me to catch pieces. Something about big news about a surprise that would show what kind of family we were. I knew that tone. She was planting seeds. I felt my stomach tighten as I watched her gather journalists and business contacts, pulling them close with smiles that promised more to come. My father hovered nearby, stern and silent, letting her do the work, but I saw his eyes cut toward me, cold and deliberate. I turned away and nearly stumbled when I noticed staff rolling in equipment. A widescreen cables, a projector, being set near the stage. Guests murmured with interest, their faces lighting with the excitement of a secret about to be shared. A wedding did not need this kind of reveal, not unless something else was planned. My pulse quickened. The music kept playing, couples twirling, laughter echoing, but behind it, I felt something building, a tension that seemed to aim directly at me. Samantha passed me, then her gown sweeping the marble, her smile polished and cruel. She leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You will see," she whispered, and walked on, her groom trailing behind with eyes fixed on the floor. He looked uneasy, but said nothing. His silence told me enough. He knew at least in part what was coming. I watched as Sam joined my mother near the stage, whispering with the technician who adjusted the laptop connected to the screen. They pointed, gestured, and nodded, as though rehearsing a performance. A chill spread through me. Whatever this was, it was not about love or marriage or celebration. It was about me. A guest I barely knew stopped me with a smile, their voice casual but sharp. "Your sister is lucky to have you," they said. Another leaned close and added, "I hear there is a surprise coming. Must be something big." Their words were meant kindly, perhaps, but they landed like stones. My family had already told them a story, and in that story, I was a character about to play my part, whether I agreed or not. My glass trembled in my hand. I searched the room for a safe face, but everywhere I looked, I saw expectation. It was in the smiles of strangers, in the nods of acquaintances, in the way the crowd seemed to lean toward me without moving. They were waiting, though none of them knew exactly what for. I thought of the look my father had given me earlier, sharp and cold, and the way my mother's nails had pressed into my arm as she whispered about family. I thought of Sam smirk her words about my empty rooms and my single life. Piece by piece, the truth settled on me. This was not a moment that had happened by chance. This was a stage carefully set, a trap built long before tonight. They had not only expected me to give in, they had arranged it so I would have no way out. My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breath. Was I overthinking? Could I be wrong? But then, I saw Sam again whispering to the technician, her face glowing with anticipation, as though she were the star of a show about to begin. My instincts screamed that I was not imagining this. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, and the band lowered their instruments. The chatter softened, and all around me guests leaned toward the stage as the screen flickered to life. My palms grew damp, and I clutched my glass as though it could steady me. I did not know yet what would appear on that screen, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My humiliation had been planned long before I stepped into this room. The ballroom lights dimmed, the band lowered their instruments, and a hush fell over the guests as the screen flickered to life. At first, it was harmless enough. Photographs of Sam and Daniel smiling at dinner tables and strolling hand in hand, soft music playing behind the images. People cooed and clapped politely. Then, the images changed. I saw sweeping views of Central Park, the glass windows of my own building, and finally, the living room of my penthouse. My chest went cold. Words appeared across the screen, bold and bright. Our new home thanks to Vivi's wedding gift. My ears rang. A ripple went through the crowd, surprise, admiration, applause, and all of it turning toward me. I could feel their eyes on my face, waiting for me to nod, to smile, to confirm what they believed was generosity. My mother stepped to the microphone, her voice smooth as silk. Tonight is not only about love, she said it is also about family. Thanks to her sisters, kindness, Sam and Daniel will begin their new life in a home that represents all we stand for. She gestured toward me with a radiant smile as if I should stand and bow. The applause swelled. I felt the blood pounding in my ears. My breath caught, but I forced my voice steady. That is not true, I said loud enough to carry. The words cut through the music, through the clapping. Every head turned. I took a step forward, my heart hammering. The penthouse is mine. I never agreed to give it away. The room froze. Gasps scattered across the ballroom like dropped glass. My mother's face tightened. Sam's lips parted in shock before twisting into fury. My father's eyes flashed, warning me to stop. Sam's voice rose sharp and angry. You cannot do this, Vivi. You are ruining everything. She stormed toward me, her gown sweeping the floor, her face red with rage. You are selfish. You owe this family. I stood my ground, though my hands shook. I owe nothing, I said. The words trembled, but they were true. Whispers swept through the crowd. What is happening? Did she say she never agreed? My sister's eyes burned into me. You are pathetic, she spat. Alone in that empty apartment, clinging to it like it makes you worth something. My throat ached, but I refused to look away. Then before I could prepare myself, her hand came fast and hard across my cheek. The sound cracked through the silence, sharp as a whip. My face burned, my head jolted, and for one stunned heartbeat, the room was utterly still. No laughter, no applause, only silence so deep it pressed on my chest. Then I heard it, the soft clicks of phones, the shifting of people raising their cameras. A whisper broke the quiet near the back. She is a lawyer, and her sister just slapped her. My cheek throbbed, my skin hot under the sting, but the deeper wound was in my chest. My own family had done this. My sister had struck me in front of 200 witnesses. I refused to cry. I would not give them that. I stood still, my hands at my sides, my back straight, though my heart raced so hard I thought it would tear from my ribs. Sam glared at me, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for me to apologize. My mother's face twisted with panic, my father's jaw clenched. The guests stared in wide-eyed silence. Phones hovered like weapons, capturing every second. The air was suffocating heavy with the weight of 200 eyes. My cheek burned, but my voice did not shake as I whispered to myself, "This is not the end. It is only the beginning." My cheek still burned, the sting pulsing through my skin, but the weight pressing on me came from the silence in that room. 200 eyes fixed on me, phones raised, every guest waiting to see if I would collapse or fight. My mother stepped quickly into the circle, her hand brushing my arm with a grip that felt like iron. "Stop this, Victoria," she hissed through a smile, meant for the crowd. "Just smile and nod. Do not make a scene." Her voice was a plea and a warning all at once. I turned my face toward her, and the mask she wore only made my chest ache. She cared more about saving the image of the family than about the handprint burning across my skin. My father joined her, his voice low sharp, carrying the weight of command I had heard all my life. "Enough," he said. "Do the right thing. Give it to your sister." The words dropped on me like stones, familiar stones, the same ones he had used to crush every one of my protests growing up. The right thing always for them, never for me. Sam's laugh was soft but cruel. "You will never win against me," she whispered, leaning close enough that only I could hear. "You never have." Her eyes glimmered with triumph. In her mind, the slap had sealed my defeat. The silence of the room had buried me, and now all I had to do was bow my head. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to shout every word I had swallowed over the years, but instead memories broke through like glass. I saw myself at 10 years old, with my report card full of A's ignored while Sam twirled in a new dress. I saw myself at 17, working shifts until midnight to save for college, coming home to find Sam praised for a part in the prom committee. I saw myself at 22 exhausted in law school, told by my mother that I was antisocial while Sam's dropped classes were excused as her exploring options. And I saw myself now, standing in the middle of a ballroom, treated not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a sacrifice. The slap was not the beginning. It was the end of a long line of cuts, each one telling me I was less, each one asking me to give more. My hands trembled, my breath uneven, and for a moment I almost gave in. I thought, if I just nod, if I just let this pass, I can survive the night. But the voice inside me would not let it go. If you stay silent now, it whispered, you lose everything. Not just the penthouse, not just the home you built. You lose your voice. You lose the right to say no ever again. My heart pounded so hard I thought the sound might fill the room. Fear pressed down on me, telling me to keep the peace, to endure, to shrink myself once more. But another force rose up stronger than fear, forged from every slight and every dismissal. Anger. Not the kind that burns out fast, but the kind that steadies your hands. I lifted my eyes from Sam's smug face and looked at the crowd. I saw the journalists who had once interviewed me about my cases, the business contacts who had shaken my hand with respect, the colleagues who knew me as someone who never gave in. They were here, and they had seen it all. For the first time in my life, I realized I was not powerless. I had witnesses, I had proof, and I had my own voice. I straightened my shoulders, the sting on my cheek still alive, but it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like fuel. My fear throbbed, but my decision was clear. No more silence. Not tonight, not ever again. Slowly, I reached into my clutch. My fingers brushed the cool edge of my phone, and I felt the weight of it in my palm. Sam's smile faltered her eyes, flicking toward the gesture. My mother's nails dug deeper into my arm as though she could stop me, but it was too late. My choice was made. My whole life they had silenced me, but tonight I would be the one to decide how the story ended. I drew my phone from my clutch and lifted it in my hand, not high, just enough for the people closest to me to notice. The murmur in the room shifted, curious and uneasy. My mother's voice came sharp but soft through a frozen smile. "Put that away, Victoria, you are embarrassing yourself." My father's jaw clenched, his tone hard as stone. "Enough. Do the right thing. Give it to your sister." They still believed I would bow. They still thought fear would keep me quiet. But my cheek still throbbed where Sam's hand had struck, and I knew silence would mean losing more than my home. I lowered my eyes to the screen, my thumbs trembling as I typed, but the words came quickly and clearly. To the group chat with my lawyer friends, to journalists who had interviewed me before, to business contacts who knew my reputation. I told them what had happened, that my family had demanded I give up my penthouse, that they had humiliated me publicly, and that my sister had slapped me in front of 200 guests. My heart hammered, but my mind was steady. This was the truth, and it was time to let it out. I felt the air shift before I even pressed send. Sam had seen it too. She lunged forward, her hand reaching for my phone. "Give it to me," she hissed, her voice ragged with panic. I turned my body, clutching it tight against me. A gasp rippled through the crowd as she grabbed at me and failed her desperation plain for all to see. For the first time that night, it was not me on display, but her. My thumb tapped the screen. The message flew. The vibration in my hand was small. Almost nothing, but it felt like thunder rolling through me. Too late, I whispered, my voice low but sharp enough for her to hear. Her eyes widened, her face draining of colour. A beat of silence, then the sound began. One phone buzzed, then another, then a dozen. All around the ballroom, pockets of light glowed as guests looked down at their screens. Their eyes flicked from the words to me, then back to Sam. Confusion first, then unease, then whispers spreading like a tide. She sent it to everyone. My sister's lips parted, her breath quick and shallow. "Delete it," she hissed at me. "You do not understand what you have done." My mother's voice rose behind her, sharp with fear. "Victoria, stop this. Now you are destroying your family." My father's face darkened, his voice low and hard. "You will regret this." But their fear told me what I needed to know. They were no longer in control. Their hands, which had guided every detail of this night, were shaking. The story was no longer theirs to tell. The buzzing grew louder as more phones lit up, more heads bent together, reading, murmuring. I caught pieces as the whispers grew. Did she say they demanded her home? She was slapped right here. Her own family. The silence that had suffocated me after the slap was gone. The air now was restless, shifting, alive. And for the first time since I stepped into that ballroom, I felt the weight lift from my chest. My sister stood shaking in her gown. My mother's smile cracked my father's glare, empty of power. They looked at me as though I had become someone they no longer knew, someone they could no longer control. I raised my head, the sting of my cheek still alive, and I spoke clearly enough for all to hear. I am not the one who should be embarrassed here. A stir ran through the crowd, soft gasps, the shifting of feet, and the cold glances now aimed at them instead of me. I could feel it in my bones. The tide had turned. My mother clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered through clenched teeth, "Stop this. Victoria, you will ruin us." My father's voice came low and sharp. "Enough, you are finished, embarrassing this family." And Sam, her face blotched with fear and anger, pleaded in a shaky whisper, "Delete it. We can fix this, please." Their panic told me everything. They had built this night like a stage, and now the curtain was falling not on me but on them. I pulled free from my mother's grip and walked toward the stage. The guests parted without a word, their faces tense, their eyes following me. I climbed the small steps, the lights hot on my skin, the microphone waiting in its stand. For the first time all evening, I felt steady. I gripped it, lifted my chin and let my voice carry. "You all saw what just happened," I said. "You saw my sister slap me. You heard my family demand my home." My words hung heavy in the ballroom, no music to cover them, no polite laughter to soften them, only silence and the shifting of bodies as people leaned closer. My heart pounded, but my voice did not waver. "They told you I had given them my penthouses as a gift. That was a lie. They never asked me. They tried to force me. And when I refused, they humiliated me here in front of all of you." Sam shook her head wildly, her hands outstretched. "She is lying," she cried, her voice breaking. "This is not true." My mother raised her hands, trying to calm the room. "A misunderstanding," she said with a brittle smile, "just a family misunderstanding." But the room was no longer theirs to control. I reached for my phone, the screen glowing in my hand. I opened an email and raised it so my voice could carry over the hush. An email from my father to a realtor dated last month. I read the words slowly, each one striking the silence like a hammer. "The penthouse will be sold immediately after the wedding. Expected market value $4.5 million. Gasps erupted across the room. The sound was sharp and alive, louder than any applause. I watched faces shift, admiration twisting into disgust. I saw Judge Chen's eyes narrow, her lips pressed into a firm line. I saw David Rodriguez, the journalist, his fingers flying across his phone, recording every word. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was written, undeniable, and it was theirs to see. Sam's knees buckled and she grabbed the edge of a chair. "No," she stammered, "it is not what it looks like." My mother's mask cracked, her face pale, her hands fluttering helplessly. My father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew the fight was over. I lowered the phone and let my eyes sweep the room. "This is what my family tried to do," I said. "They told me I owed them that family comes first, but family does not steal from you. Family does not try to sell your life's work behind your back. My voice rose steady and strong. They thought they could shame me into silence, but lies do not stand when the truth is written down. Murmurs spread guests, shaking their heads, some already gathering their things, unwilling to be part of the wreckage. Others stared openly at my parents, their faces hard with judgment. I stood there, my cheek still burning from the slap, but inside me something had shifted. I was no longer the quiet daughter, the overlooked sister. I was the woman who had spoken the truth, and nothing could erase it now. The ballroom, once a place of glitter and perfection, was unravelling, and for the first time that night, I felt free. They thought they could steal what I built in silence, but tonight I made sure the whole world heard them. The words still hung in the air as the room broke apart into chaos. Guests whispered in tight circles, some slipping toward the exits, others pressing closer to Judge Chen, or to the journalist scribbling furiously into his phone. The musicians quietly packed away their instruments, their eyes down as if they could erase what they had witnessed. The wedding had ended, but not in celebration. My sister staggered forward, her face streaked with tears, her voice high and desperate. It was just a slap, she cried, just a moment of emotion. Everyone gets carried away sometimes. I turned to face her, the sting still burning across my cheek. No, I said clearly, it was assault and you all saw it. My words carried through the silence like a stone breaking water. A murmur spread, some nodding, some whispering the word assault as though they had been waiting for someone to name it. My mother rushed to me, her hands clutching mine, her face cracked with panic. Please, stop this, she begged. You will destroy us all. You have already won. Just let it go. I looked into her eyes and saw the truth. She did not care about me or even about Sam. She cared about the wreckage of their reputation, the one thing she worshipped more than anything. My father tried to step forward, but his voice faltered under the weight of the stares around him. Enough, he rasped, but it sounded hollow. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who had always towered over me, but as someone small, exposed, defeated. Daniel stood near the stage, his hand running through his hair, his voice thin with fear. We can work something out, Vivi, he said, his eyes darting to the guests who had already begun to whisper his name. A voice near me cut through the air. Isn't he in finance? His firm will never survive this. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He knew it too. Before anyone could answer, 2 police officers walked into the ballroom guided by hotel security. Their presence was calm but commanding, and the noise of the crowd dimmed. One officer looked at me, then at Sam, then back at me. We were told there was an incident, he said. I felt every eye swing toward me again. My sister shook her head wildly, clutching her gown. No, it was nothing, she insisted, a family matter. Please do not involve them. But the officer did not step back. Miss, he said to me, would you like to give a statement? I drew a breath, my hand steady now. Yes, I said. I told them everything, my voice even recounting the demands for my penthouse, the lies, the slap. I did not need to embellish. The truth was enough. Guests nodded, some stepped forward to confirm what they had seen. Judge Chen spoke firmly, her words cutting through any doubt. I witnessed it myself. The officer nodded, jotting notes, his calm authority sealing what had happened into fact. The weight that had pressed on me all night seemed to lift. My sister crumpled beside me, sobbing, her hands reaching for mine. Please, Vivi, please do not press charges, she begged, her voice raw and broken. My mother tried to pull her away, whispering frantically, but Sam clung to the microphone, screaming my name, her words tangled in tears. The golden child was gone. In her place was someone desperate and exposed. The police gently took her aside, one officer speaking to her softly, the other keeping watch as though to shield me. My mother covered her face with her hands. My father turned his back and walked a few paces away, silent at last. Daniel sank into a chair, his eyes blank as if he had already seen the end of his career unfolding. I stood in the centre of it all, the ballroom torn apart, my phone buzzing again and again with new messages, from allies, from journalists, from friends who had already seen the story spreading. For once, it was not me scrambling to explain or defend. It was them unraveling while I stood steady in the wreckage they had created. Hours later, I finally walked back into my penthouse, the place that had been at the center of every word, every demand, every humiliation that night. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, the quiet pressing in almost unreal after the chaos of the ballroom. The lights of the city stretched out through the glass, steady and calm, as if nothing had happened. I slipped off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and let the silence sink into me. For the first time all evening, I felt safe. This was mine. I had earned it, defended it, and no one could take it away. My body ached with exhaustion, but I could finally breathe. Then the intercom buzzed. The sound jolted me upright, sharp against the stillness. I frowned, set my glass down, and crossed the room. On the screen by the door, I saw her, Sam. Still in her wedding gown, the white fabric dirty at the hem, her makeup smeared her hair tangled. Her eyes were red and swollen, her whole body shaking as she looked up into the camera. "Please, Vivi," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please, I am sorry. I did not mean for it to go this far. You are my sister. Please let me in." I stood frozen, staring at her image. She looked so small, so undone, nothing like the woman who had slapped me across the face hours earlier in front of 200 people. My chest tightened as memories I had tried to bury pushed their way forward. I remembered us as children playing hide-and-seek in the garden, her laughter ringing as she darted behind the trees. I remembered us lying awake at night, whispering secrets, promising we would always protect each other. For a moment, my heart poured hard, reminding me of the bond we once shared before favoritism and bitterness twisted everything. But then another memory rose sharper than the rest. The sound of that slap echoing in the ballroom. Her words afterward, her face triumphant, declaring she deserved everything I had built. The way she looked at me as if I were less, as if all my work, all my sacrifices meant nothing. The image of her standing in that gown with the crowd behind her, proud and cruel, burned against the sight of her now broken and begging. I pressed my hand against the glass beside the screen, torn between the sister I had loved and the woman who had humiliated me. Her voice cracked again. "Please, Vivi, we can start over. I will make it right. Just open the door." My hand hovered near the button, trembling. Part of me longed to end the pain, to let her in, to cling to the idea of family even after everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. Family does not destroy you and call it love. Family does not steal from you, lie to you, and strike you when you refuse. Family does not laugh when you are humiliated. I had given too many chances already, and each time it cost me a piece of myself. Not this time. Not anymore. My voice came soft but firm, though she could not hear it through the screen. "I am done, Sam. I am done being the one who bends until I break." Then I pressed the button. The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not empty. It was mine. I stood there a long time, my hand still on the panel, listening to the hum of the city through the glass. Outside, the night carried on traffic moving along Central Park lights flickering in other windows. In here, there was only stillness. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. She stood out there, begging, but I had already opened the last door I needed, to the one that freed me from them. The next morning, I woke to a sound almost louder than the intercom had been the night before. My phone buzzing on the nightstand. It did not stop. I rubbed my eyes, reached for it, and saw dozens of messages stacked on top of each other, then hundreds. Friends, colleagues, even strangers. Clips of the wedding already spreading. Headlines forming. My stomach flipped as I scrolled. There it was, the video of Sam's hand striking my face, replayed over and over. Another video of me at the microphone reading my father's email. The captions beneath said things like, "Lawyer stands up to family abuse at Rit's wedding." I set the phone down and pressed my hands over my face. Overnight, my private humiliation had become something much bigger. And somehow, I was not the victim in their eyes. I was the one who had fought back. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself coffee, and tried to breathe. The television flickered in the corner, and against my better judgment, I turned it on. There it was again. Anchors discussing the video, asking whether it reflected a larger problem of entitlement and family pressure. One segment read, "The lawyer who said no." I switched it off, my heart pounding. I had not asked for any of this, but I could not ignore that it was here. By the afternoon, the calls started. My assistant Jenna told me reporters were flooding the office line. TMZ, CNN, even local news. They all wanted a statement. I told her the only thing I could. Keep it short, keep it professional. No comment beyond gratitude for the support. I did not want to pour more fuel onto the fire, but the fire had already caught. News of Sam came quickly. She had been fired from her PR job within a day. Clients pulled their contracts, saying they wanted nothing to do with her after the video. Her name trended online with words I could barely bring myself to read. Some mocked her, others raged at her sense of entitlement. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then, I remembered the way she smiled after slapping me like she had finally put me in my place. The pity faded. Daniel was next. Rumours spread that his firm was conducting an ethics review. Clients had started pulling their money, worried his judgment could not be trusted. I heard whispers that he might lose his position, maybe even more. The man who had stood silent while his wife humiliated me in front of a crowd was finally facing consequences of his own. My mother, Elaine, tried to retreat into her circle of friends, the women at her social club, who had always praised her elegance. But the club expelled her, quietly embarrassed to be connected to the scandal. Invitations dried up, calls went unanswered. The very people she had counted on for validation were gone. I imagined her sitting in that big house staring at her phone, realising she no longer had an audience. And my father, Richard. His business, already shaky, collapsed completely. Partners walked away. Clients refused to renew contracts. Word spread that he was bankrupt. The man who had spent my whole life telling me what I owed him now had nothing left to demand. One by one, they fell. Sam, without her job, Daniel under investigation, Elaine stripped of her social world, Richard drowning in debt. They had built their lives on power status and appearances, and in a single night the masks had cracked. Meanwhile, my phone kept filling. Messages from colleagues, from women I barely knew, from men who admitted they had faced similar family pressure. They called me brave. They called me strong. Judge Chen sent me a note that stopped me in my tracks. You spoke the truth, and it mattered. 14 words, but they landed with more weight than anything my parents had said to me in years. I sat by the window that night, the lights of the city stretching out, my phone buzzing still. I turned it face down on the table and let the quiet settle in. The silence felt different now. It was not the silence of being ignored or dismissed or made small. It was the silence of peace. The silence of knowing I had told the truth and survived it. For years they tried to silence me, but when I finally spoke, the silence that followed was mine. I sat in the dim light of my living room, the glass walls of the penthouse stretching above the city, the hum of Manhattan faint below me. My phone sat face up on the table screen, glowing with new messages every few seconds. Reporters, colleagues, strangers I had never met, but who now felt they had a claim to my story. There were also names I knew too well. Sam, Elaine, even Richard, all begging in their own way. I stared at it for a moment longer, then reached out and turned it face down. The vibration rattled softly against the wood, steady and relentless, but I no longer cared. I had carried their voices in my head for years, always telling me I was less, I was selfish. I did not deserve the life I built. Tonight, those voices had lost their power. I stood stretched and walked slowly toward the wide windows. My bare feet sank into the rug, the kind I once bought nervously, worrying whether it was too indulgent, too much for a woman alone. Tonight, it felt right under me. I unlatched the window and pushed it open. Cool September air rushed in, sweeping around me, lifting my hair, filling the room with the smell of the city. It felt clean even in its noise because it was real and honest, the kind of honesty my family never gave me. I leaned against the frame, looking out over Central Park. From here, the city was spread wide and endless. Lights shimmered in patterns, cars moved like streams, voices carried up from the street laughter, from strangers I would never meet. For years, I thought being high above it all would feel lonely. Tonight, it felt like freedom. I poured myself a glass of wine and held it in both hands, letting the glass warm against my palms before I took a sip. My reflection in the window startled me at first. My cheek was still faintly marked from the slap my hair pulled loose from its pins, but my eyes were steady. There was no fear left in them, just calm. The truth was, I had never wanted revenge. I had never wanted to ruin Sam's wedding or destroy my parents standing in their circles. I only wanted respect. I only wanted to be treated as if my life had value beyond what I could give them. As children, I once believed we all loved each other. That belief cost me years of guilt, bending myself until I nearly broke just to keep the peace. But tonight, for the first time, I realised I was never the problem. Sam's face at the intercom came back to me. The mascara streaks the torn gown, the voice that shook with desperation. For a moment, I had almost opened the door. Almost, but I knew if I had, it would have been the same pattern. She would have leaned on me, taken from me, smiled at me with gratitude until the next demand came, and I would have bent again. Closing that screen had been the hardest choice, but also the only one that set me free. The wine tasted sharp on my tongue as I thought of Elaine. My mother, who never shielded me, never once defended me when Sam tore me down. Even last night she whispered to me, not with love, but with fear of what others might think. And my father Richard, who stood tall in his suit, but plotted to sell my home before the wedding, flowers had even wilted. They had not wanted a daughter. They had wanted a resource, a safety net for their mistakes. The phone buzzed louder, like it wanted to remind me they were still there, still clawing. I smiled, faintly shook my head and let it ring. I would not pick it up again. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. I walked through the penthouse, slowly touching the edges of furniture, the shelves lined with books, the office door where I had built my practice late into the night. Every corner of this place carried proof of my work, my struggle, my victories. They wanted to take it as if it was a spare sweater I did not need. But this space was my life, my independence, my safety. I thought of the people who had written to me, already colleagues, thanking me for speaking up strangers, saying I gave them courage. At first, I had felt overwhelmed by the attention, but now it felt different. Maybe this story was never just mine. Maybe, by telling it, I had cracked something open for others too. That possibility made me feel stronger, as if my pain had finally been transformed into something more. I returned to the window glass, still in my hand. Below Central Park glowed dark green, under the lights, the city pulsing around it. A breeze rushed in cool and insistent, carrying with it the sound of car horns, voices, the steady rhythm of New York. For once, I did not feel small in the face of it. I felt part of it, steady and whole. I lifted the glass once more, taking a slow drink, letting the night air wash over me. My heart was quiet. My mind was still. The noise of their demands, their insults, their endless greed, it had all fallen away. And in its place, there was only this moment. Finally, I whispered into the dark, finally silence. If you are listening with a sore heart, I want you to hear this. You are not broken because someone hurt you. You are not selfish for saying no. You are not hard to love because you finally chose yourself. Pain makes the noise, but healing can be as simple as one clear choice made again and again. When you wake tomorrow and the thoughts rush in, try this. Sit for a moment and name what hurts. Write a few honest lines in a notebook. Call a friend who listens. Step outside for a slow walk and feel your feet meet the ground. Breathe in for a count that feels steady and breathe out a little longer than you breathed in. If the weight is too heavy to carry alone, there is no shame in asking for help. Many people find comfort in talking with a counsellor, meeting a support group, or joining a quiet circle at a community centre or place of faith. Some keep a small journal by the bed and empty their worries there each night. Some choose a short prayer or a simple sentence to repeat until the storm inside grows soft. Some place one small boundary each day and practice keeping it. None of these are grand gestures, but together they can lift a life. You do not have to fix everything to move forward. You only have to care for yourself in the next small moment, and then the next. If your family has been unkind, you are allowed to step back. If a promise has been broken, you are allowed to grieve. If you have stayed too long in a place that hurts, you are allowed to leave. You are also allowed to rest. Healing is not a race. It is a slow return to your own quiet voice. Tonight, mine is steady. I look out over the park and let the wind touch my face. I think of the people who stood by me and the strangers who wrote to say that my no gave them courage to find their own. I am grateful, I am calm, and I am certain that peace is not a gift given by others, it is a right we claim when we decide to live in truth. If this story met you at the right time, I hope it gave you a little light for the path you are already walking. If you want more stories that speak to hard things in a gentle way, you are welcome to subscribe and listen along when you are ready. No rush. I will be here, and so will the quiet.